A 14-year-old boy went to the movies and never came home. He was shot outside the theater in the middle of a fight. The person who pulled the trigger was 13 years old. No warning, no time to react, just a few seconds, and it was over. His name was Truecrime Holloway. He was 14. A son. A brother. Someone his family expected to see again that night. The shooter was Terrence Howard Jr., just 13 years old. Both of them showed up to the same place, for what should have been a normal night. But outside that theater, something changed. A fight broke out, voices raised, people moved in. And in that moment, everything came down to one question. Was this self-defense, or a decision that never should have happened? Because 2 days before that night, a gun was stolen from an unlocked car. And that one choice followed him straight into a crowded space. Welcome to Dark Trace Crime Stories. In this episode, we're going to walk through exactly what led to that moment, what really happened during the fight, and how a courtroom later tried to answer a question that still divides people. Because when the verdict finally came in, it wasn't what many expected. And there's one detail about that night that still doesn't have a clear answer. Before we get into this, where are you watching from? And have you ever seen something like this happen in your area?
It was Saturday night, and 14-year-old Truecrime Holloway wanted to go to the movies.
He begged me to go to that movie. I sat there probably 15, 20 minutes, going back and forth with him.
Truecrime's dad, Tommy Holloway, said he didn't want to, but he gave his son a ride to the Galleria Cinema on Margie Drive.
20 minutes later, we get a phone call saying something that happened to my son.
Truecrime Holloway, known to family and friends as Nunk, was just 14 years old. He was from Warner Robins, Georgia, a young boy surrounded by people who knew him, loved him, and expected to watch him grow. He was raised by his parents, Tommy Holloway and Shawnetta Jones, in a close-knit family built on strong bonds. At 14, his world was simple. Friends. Laughter. Time spent outside the house, doing what most teenagers do, going out, hanging around, enjoying small moments that don't seem important until they're gone. There were no widely known reports of him being involved in violence or ongoing conflict. Some say he wasn't the type to start trouble, but his exact role that night remains unclear. And on February 3rd, 2024, all of that would come to an end.
He says his son was a good kid who loved to play sports.
My son was a star. When he opened his mouth to smile, he done brighten up everybody's room. He wasn't no troublemaker at all.
Holloway says violence and crime among teens is on the rise, and his family tried their best to keep their son away from that.
But y'all gotta talk to these children about these guns. Ain't no rewind button. You can't start over once you done took a life. And it's killing me that I went there to protect him this time.
Holloway says he will no longer be able to see his son and hopes something can be done about the gun violence.
I don't know what I'm gonna do without that little boy.
At the center of what happened next is Terrence Howard Jr., just 13 years old at the time. Like Truecrime, he was part of the same world. A teenager, moving in the same kind of social spaces, surrounded by peers, navigating the same environment. There was nothing, at least on the surface, that separated him from the others around him that night. But 2 days before the shooting, something changed. On February 1st, 2024, Howard made a decision that would later become one of the most important details in this entire case. According to court testimony, he stole a handgun from an unlocked vehicle. He had been told about the gun by a friend, and instead of leaving it where it was, he removed it and kept it. There was no immediate confrontation. No fight at that moment. No visible urgency. Just a choice. And that choice didn't end there. He didn't report it, he didn't discard it, he kept it. That decision, quiet, quick, and seemingly small, became the starting point of everything that followed. Because once that gun left that vehicle, it entered a completely different space. A space filled with people. With tension. With unpredictability. And that's what makes this moment stand out. It wasn't made during chaos, it wasn't made under pressure. It was made in a calm moment, with time to think. That's why it's often seen as the point where everything could have been stopped before it even began. Because without that gun, what happened 2 days later may have looked very different. A disagreement might have stayed a disagreement, a fight might have ended like most teenage fights do, without anyone losing their life. But the presence of a weapon changed the stakes completely. And Howard didn't just take the gun, he carried it forward. 2 days later, on February 3rd, he went to the Galleria movie theater in Warner Robins. It was a public place, filled with other teenagers, families, and groups gathered for a normal night out. According to the defense, he brought the gun with him with the intention of showing it to someone. Not using it, just showing it. But bringing a firearm into a crowded setting introduces a risk that can't be controlled. Once it's there, any situation, no matter how small, can shift in seconds. And that's exactly what happened. Because by the time tensions rose outside that theater, the situation was no longer just about words or physical confrontation. There was a weapon involved. And once that line is crossed, the outcome is no longer predictable. What started as a decision made in a quiet moment carried into a space where anything could happen. And when it did, there was no way to take that decision back. 2 days later, that decision followed him to the movies. On the night of February 3, 2024, the Galleria movie theater in Warner Robins, Georgia, was filled with the kind of energy you'd expect from a weekend evening. Teenagers gathered in groups. Some were there for movies. Others were there just to spend time together. It was a social space, loud, active, familiar. Among those present were Truecrime's Holloway and Terrence Howard Jr. Howard had come with a group for what was described as a birthday gathering. It wasn't unusual. This is where teenagers met, laughed, moved between conversations, and formed clusters that shifted throughout the night. But at some point, the atmosphere outside the theater began to change. Groups started interacting more directly. Words were exchanged. The tone shifted. What had been a normal gathering started to feel tense. There isn't one single moment that marks when everything turned, but witnesses described a gradual escalation. Movement became more aggressive. Voices got louder. People began closing distance instead of keeping it. And then a fight broke out. Multiple teenagers became involved. It wasn't isolated to just 2 individuals. It spread quickly, drawing others in, creating confusion. In situations like this, it doesn't take much for things to get out of control, especially in a crowded area where people are reacting at the same time. According to the defense, this is where things became physical for Howard and the people around him. They argued that his friend was being attacked, that the situation wasn't just verbal, it had already crossed into violence. At some point during the altercation, Howard himself was reportedly struck. From that perspective, the environment wasn't just chaotic, it was threatening. The defense would later claim that in that moment, Howard believed he and his friend were in danger, that he felt overwhelmed, that he thought someone was reaching toward his waist, toward the gun he had brought with him. And in that split second, fear took over. But prosecutors challenged that version of events. They argued that while there was a fight, there was no immediate threat that justified the use of deadly force. No clear evidence that Howard was being attacked in a way that required pulling a firearm. They emphasized that the situation, while chaotic, had not reached a point where lethal action was necessary. At the center of this case is that conflict, 2 very different interpretations of the same moment. One side sees fear. The other sees a decision that escalated everything. And then the moment came. In the middle of that fight, Howard pulled out the gun. There was no time for people to react. No warning that could stop what was about to happen. He fired. The shots rang out in a space that, just minutes earlier, had been filled with conversation and movement. One of those bullets struck Truecrime's Holloway. He was 14 years old. He died from those injuries. 2 other individuals were also hit during the shooting. They survived, but their lives were changed in an instant as well. And just like that, everything stopped. The noise, the movement, the tension that had been building. All of it replaced by something heavier. Panic set in. People scattered. What had been a crowded social space turned into a scene of confusion and fear. Some ran. Others froze. The reality of what had just happened began to settle in, piece by piece. A teenage fight, something that, in many cases, ends with nothing more than injuries or separation, had turned into a fatal shooting. And there was no reversing it. No second chance to step back, no way to undo the moment. Only the aftermath remained. For the people who were there, it happened quickly. Too quickly to fully process. One moment blending into the next until the outcome became clear. A 14-year-old boy had lost his life. And the person responsible was another teenager. In the hours and days that followed, people would try to make sense of what happened. They would look at the fight, the actions, the decisions, searching for clarity. But one part of that night remains uncertain. Some say Truecrime wasn't the type to start trouble. But in that moment, exactly what role he played remains unclear. What is clear, though, is the outcome. A gathering that started like any other ended in loss. And everything that followed would be shaped by what happened in those few seconds.
Sergeant Justin Clark says that it all started at the Galleria Cinemas on Margie Drive. He says that a group of juveniles had just been kicked out of the theaters.
Once they left the movie theater, they migrated across the street to the Mitsubishi dealership over there near Sonic.
Clark said they got into some kind of argument. He says Truecrime wasn't part of the argument, but ended up getting shot in the head.
I'm sitting there like, how something happened to him? He just got out the car with me.
Holloway says violence and crime among teens is on the rise, and his family tried their best to keep their son away from that.
But y'all gotta talk to these children about these guns. Ain't no rewind button. You can't start over once you done took a life. And it's killing me that I went there to protect them this time.
In the seconds after the shots were fired, the scene outside the theater shifted completely. What had been loud, crowded, and social turned into confusion. People started running. Some didn't know where to go. Others froze, trying to understand what had just happened. There were voices, shouting, calling out names, asking questions that no one could answer in that moment. Then came the panic. Teenagers who had been standing just feet away scattered in different directions. Some tried to get away from the area. Others stayed behind, looking for friends, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. And at the center of it all was Truecrime Holloway. He had been shot. The reality of that began to settle in quickly for those closest to him. The situation was no longer just a fight. It was something far more serious, something final. Emergency services were called. First responders arrived and began securing the scene, working through the confusion and movement to assess what had happened. Attention turned immediately to the victims. What had started as a gathering place was now an active scene, with authorities trying to bring order to something that had unfolded in seconds. But unlike many cases where details take time to emerge, this situation had one key factor. There were people everywhere. Witnesses. Dozens of them. Teenagers who had seen different parts of the incident. Some saw the fight. Others saw the moment the gun was pulled. Some only heard the shots. But together, those accounts helped form a clearer picture of what had happened. And because of that, the focus quickly turned to the person responsible. Terrence Howard Jr. was identified as the shooter. The case didn't begin with uncertainty about who fired the weapon. That part was established early. As investigators began collecting statements and reviewing what witnesses described, the legal process was already starting to take shape. But outside of that process, another reality was unfolding. For Truecrime's family, this was no longer a case. It was a loss. A 14-year-old who had left home and never returned. A son whose absence would be felt immediately and permanently. The kind of loss that doesn't settle over time, it stays. Family members, relatives, and friends began to gather, trying to support one another while processing what had happened. For them, the details didn't need to be explained. The outcome was already clear. And in the broader community, the reaction was just as heavy. Warner Robins is not unfamiliar with gatherings like the one at the theater. Spaces like that are part of everyday life. But what happened that night forced people to look at those spaces differently. A place meant for entertainment became the location of a fatal shooting. And the fact that both the victim and the shooter were so young only deepened that reaction. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about how quickly it happened. A fight, a weapon, a decision. And everything changed. As the days passed, conversations began to form around responsibility, safety, and how something like this could unfold in such a short amount of time. But while the community tried to process it, the case itself was only beginning. Because what happened that night was just one part of the story. The legal battle, the arguments, and the final outcome. Those would take much longer to unfold. But what happened next would take years to unfold. By April 2024, the case surrounding the death of Truecrime Holloway moved from the scene outside the theater into the courtroom. And the charges brought forward were serious. Terrence Howard Jr. was charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and multiple firearm-related offenses. These charges reflected the weight of what prosecutors believed had happened that night. Not just a tragic outcome during a fight, but the use of a weapon in a situation that led directly to a fatal result. But from the beginning, the defense pushed a different narrative. Not one of intent, not one of planned action, but one centered on fear, confusion, and reaction. Although charges were filed in 2024, the case itself did not move quickly to trial. Like many serious cases involving juveniles, especially those with conflicting witness accounts, the legal process stretched forward. Months turned into procedural delays, hearings, and preparation from both sides. By the time the case reached trial in 2026, the incident outside the Galleria Theater was no longer just a moment in time. It had become a heavily debated legal argument. 2 years had passed, but the question remained the same. What exactly happened in those final seconds? The prosecution built their case around responsibility. They focused on how the situation began before the fight ever started. A gun had been taken from an unlocked vehicle 2 days earlier. That weapon had then been carried into a crowded public space. And when conflict broke out, it was used. To them, this was not a split-second accident without context. It was a chain of decisions that escalated into something deadly. They argued that even if a fight occurred, it did not justify the use of lethal force. In their view, there was no immediate threat that required the introduction of a firearm. The presence of the gun itself changed the entire outcome. On the other side, the defense focused on what happened inside the moment itself. They described chaos, rapid movement, multiple people involved in a physical fight, a situation where things were unfolding too quickly to fully process. Their argument centered on perception. They claimed that Terrence Howard Jr. believed he was in danger, that he thought the situation had escalated beyond control, that in the middle of the altercation, fear became the driving force behind his actions. From that perspective, the shooting was not planned. It was not calculated. It was a reaction inside a fast-moving confrontation where decisions were made in seconds. But prosecutors rejected that framing. They pointed back to the earlier decision, the removal of the gun from the vehicle. To them, that moment mattered just as much as what happened outside the theater, because it showed that the weapon was not introduced by accident during the fight. It was already there. And that detail became central to their argument. At the heart of the courtroom battle was a single divide. One side saw a teenager reacting in fear during a chaotic fight. The other saw a teenager who brought a deadly weapon into a situation where it did not need to be. Neither side could fully explain every second of what happened outside the theater. Witnesses remembered different angles, different moments, different fragments of the same event. And that made the case harder to define, because the law had to answer a question that didn't have a clean answer. When does fear stop being an explanation and start becoming responsibility? Do you think this was self-defense or a decision that never should have happened? Let me know in the comments. After years of legal arguments, witness testimony, and competing interpretations of the same moment, the case against Terrence Howard Jr. finally reached its conclusion in court. The jury was tasked with deciding whether what happened outside the Galleria Theater was murder, or something less legally defined, shaped by fear, chaos, and split-second decisions. When the verdict was read, the outcome was mixed. He was found not guilty of murder. But the court did not see the case as a simple act of self-defense either. Instead, he was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, and weapons-related charges. The distinction mattered. It meant the court rejected the idea of premeditated intent to kill, but also did not accept that the shooting was fully justified under self-defense. It placed the responsibility somewhere in the middle, acknowledging both the presence of a violent confrontation and the decision to use a firearm during it. In the courtroom, the reaction reflected that divide. For some, there was a sense of relief that the charge of murder did not stand. For others, there was frustration that the outcome did not fully reflect the loss of Truecrime Holloway, a 14-year-old whose life ended that night outside the theater. The emotional weight of the verdict was heavy on both sides. It represented closure in a legal sense, but not emotional resolution. Because cases like this rarely leave everyone with the same feeling of justice. Some saw the outcome as accountability within a complicated situation. Others saw it as a compromise that failed to fully address the severity of what was lost. Then came sentencing. At just 15 years old at the time of sentencing, Howard stood before the court facing the consequences of a decision made when he was even younger. The judge imposed a sentence of 32 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. It was a ruling that reflected the seriousness of the charges, even after the murder conviction was removed. A decision that acknowledged both the violent outcome and the circumstances surrounding how it unfolded. A teenager, now tied to a decades-long sentence. A courtroom decision that would shape the rest of his life. And on the other side, a family still dealing with an irreversible loss. In the end, the court could only define responsibility in legal terms. It could assign charges, determine guilt, and set a sentence. But it could not undo what happened outside that theater. One life ended, another permanently altered.
You didn't just steal this boy's car or punch him in the mouth or whatever. You stopped his heart from beating forever.
Judge Edward Lukemire made it clear that in his courtroom, age will not excuse killing someone.
The law doesn't require this great intellect. There's another human being, and they're gone because of you.
On Tuesday, the jury found Terrence Howard Jr. guilty of voluntary manslaughter, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and possession of a weapon during a felony.
You went from A to Z in what you did. You took another human being's life.
Howard's mother spoke during sentencing.
My son would have never brandished that weapon, nor would he have shot if he did not feel like his life was about to be taken or that he would be seriously beaten to death.
Despite her statement and the defense's argument that said the shooting was self-defense, Lukemire sentenced Howard to 37 years. He'll spend at least 32 of those in prison. Truquavius' great-aunt Shalita Austin says although justice is served, the hole in her family's heart will never be filled.
But I can't.
At the center of everything that happened is Truquavis Holloway, a 14-year-old who left home for what should have been an ordinary night and never returned. For his family, there is no courtroom outcome that can bring balance to what was lost. No sentence that restores what was taken. Just memories of who he was and the life he was supposed to continue living. He was a son to Tommy Holloway and Shawnetta Jones. A brother. A young boy growing up in Warner Robins, Georgia, surrounded by people who cared about him deeply. His absence is not just a moment in time. It is something that continues to be felt in every part of the lives he touched. What happened outside that theater did not just change one night. It changed 2 families forever in completely different ways, but with the same lasting weight. On one side, a life ended far too early. On the other, a teenager now facing decades behind bars. And when you look back at everything, the gathering, the argument, the fight, the gun, it all leads back to a series of decisions that escalated beyond what anyone could take back. This didn't start with violence. It started with a decision. A decision that moved from one moment into another until it reached a point where nothing could stop it anymore. And that is what makes this case so difficult to process. Not just the outcome, but how quickly everything unfolded once that chain began. As we close this story, we return to the people at the center of it. Not just the names in a case file, but the lives behind them. The families who continued to carry the weight of that night. The friends who remember it differently. And a community still trying to make sense of how something like this happened in a place so familiar. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories. Because these stories aren't just about what happened, they're about making sure it doesn't happen again.